Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn. Today's video is another spoiler video for the Magic the Gathering Foundations expansion. In this video, we actually have 2 days worth of spoilers to cover, all of the spoilers from day 4 and day 5. That's Monday and Tuesday. We're going to cover all of it and be completely up to date with all of the spoilers at the point that this video drops, which is exciting. There's a lot of juicy craziness to talk about, so we're going to try and dive right in here. Before we do, make sure you like the video if you haven't already. It's you guys liking the video that helps it get out to so many more people, helps the channel grow, and I wouldn't be able to do it without you, so thank you so much to those that do it. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons of crazy spoiler content on the way, some more crazy deck ideas that I've been brewing that I have yet to put up on the channel. Those are coming soon, so look forward to all of that. Also, catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/quarantinedcapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Now, with all of that ramble out of the way, let's dig right in here. We're starting with Scrawling Crawler, a 3-mana, 3/2 artifact creature, Phyrexian construct. Phyrexian. Shut up, Richard. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player loses 1 life. So this is sort of like a Needlehead, that Needlehead card that just dropped in Duskmourn. It's kind of like Sheoldred, but it also has like Howling Mine attached to it. This is kind of a crazy card, to be honest, and even crazier that it's colorless and can fit into anything. This feels really good alongside something like Sheoldred, where not only are you going to be making them lose even more life every time they draw a card, but you're also going to force them to draw more cards and lose more of that life subsequently. So, seems kind of nutty. I'm not entirely sure exactly where this card wants to be. Maybe just in a deck like that, with a ton of payoff for forcing your opponent to draw cards and that sort of thing. Getting to draw cards yourself off of it, like I said, like a Howling Mind is really good. Howling Mind. Did I say Howling Mind? I'm tired. I clearly need more coffee. But anyway, drawing more cards is awesome. One interesting thing I will point out about this card is both of you draw the extra card at the beginning of your upkeep. So it's not like Howling Mind where they get to draw an extra card on their turn and you draw an extra card on your turn. Instead, you're both drawing a card during your upkeep, and I don't know if that's better or worse, but it's definitely interesting, and I could see this popping up in a lot of different brews. I'm excited to brew with it, so if you have ideas about what kind of deck you'd want to build around this card, definitely let me know in the comments. I feel like there's some potential. But moving on, we've got Billowing Shriekmass, 1 black and 3 for a 2/3 spirit with flying. When this creature enters, you mill 3 cards, and then it has the Threshold ability, so if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, it gets a permanent +2/+1. Becomes a 4/4 flyer, 4/4 mana. 4/4, 4/4. That's actually really good in Limited, at least. In Constructed, this is going to be too slow. It's not quite going to make the cut there, but this is meant for Limited for sure, and it's going to be a staple in any kind of archetype where you're self-milling or filling up your graveyard quick, because if you're doing that anyway, you're going to consistently get to that threshold super fast, and this is almost always going to be a 4/4 flyer for 4 that also contributes even more cards to that strategy by milling an extra 3 when you play it. So in those decks where you're able to sort of build around those different kinds of archetypes that fill up your graveyard, this is going to be amazing and probably be a really high pick because it will consistently be that 4/4 flyer for 4, which is just amazing. Outside of that, it's okay, you know, but if most of the time it's a 2/3 flyer with a silver lining value of sometimes it'll turn into a 4/4 later in the game, it's not nearly as good. But for the right archetype, this thing's just nuts in Limited, and you're going to want to pick it high. Next up, we've got Ashru Animist, a 4/4 lizard druid with trample for 4 mana in the colors of Gruul. And if that wasn't enough, when this creature attacks, another target creature you control gains trample and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is this creature's power. This card is perfect. This is what I want to see for Gruul. It's almost on rate as a body already. 4/4 Trampler for 4. Not quite on rate based on today's Magic and power creep, right? Because power creep's a thing. So it's not quite on rate just as a 4/4 Trampler. But with that ability, this is actually really, really solid. And I love that it scales, because as you increase the power of Ashru Animist with spells or auras or whatever the case may be, you can actually start to give away some of that other extra power to another creature as well when this triggers. So just this base ability of giving out +4/+4 in trample every single time you swing kind of makes this feel like it's an 8/8 trampler in a way for 4 mana. You do want to go wide with creatures in order to utilize that, but I'm wondering if maybe we can use it in a deck with something like Enduring Courage so that we can give everything haste. Being able to swing with this guy with haste would be kind of insane, especially because he'd get the +2 power buff and give something else +6/+6 and trample. That sounds like a deck. Is it fast enough to compete in today's standard meta? I don't know. We're going to have to try, but the potential is definitely there. I think this guy's really cool. But next up, we have Zombify. Zombify is back. 1 black and 3 for a sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. We just got Rite of the Moth in Duskmourn, which is a 4 mana card that brings back a creature. So it's nice to see Zombify return and get sort of that staple baseline spell that does that same ability for 4 mana. Zombify here is slightly better than that card in that it only takes 1 color of mana, and it doesn't come onto the battlefield with a finality counter on it like it does with Rite of the Moth. But Rite of the Moth is actually a better card overall because you get the flashback, so you get 2 whole uses of the card. So I do think Rite of the Moth is a better card, but there are ways in which Zombify is better, and like I said, I just think it's really nice having this as sort of a baseline, setting the benchmark for this kind of ability and what it should cost in Standard, and having that be a part of Foundations for the next 5 or forever years. So, really cool to see Zombify come back. Next up, we've got Extravagant Replication. 2 blue and 4 for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of another target non-land permanent you control. This seems kind of insane. Granted, it's sort of expensive, but it almost reminds me of like a mini Doppelgang. We've seen Doppelgang decks on the ladder recently in Standard, in Arena, and they're kind of a thing right now, right? You ramp, you build up to one huge Doppelgang and make a bunch of copies of a bunch of stuff. This kind of feels similar. You need a decent amount of mana in order to drop this, just like Doppelgang. The difference being it doesn't quite cost as much as Doppelgang, and it can just start to trigger every single turn instead of having to get all of the triggers all at once, right? Once a turn, you get a token of any non-land permanent. That just seems... I don't know, that seems really good to me. You could use this with the Green Overlord, for example. You can ramp into it, get it out sooner because of playing the Green Overlord, and then use it to make copies of the Green Overlord to ramp into more things. So, will this be a replacement for Doppelgang? Probably not. Will it slot in next to Doppelgang in the same deck? Maybe. Is there some other new crazy deck that this gets used in that it's actually better in? That's a completely different kind of deck. I don't know. Possibly. The potential is there. I think the power level of this card is just really nuts. So, I'm excited to see what people brew with it. I'm going to try and brew up some stuff for sure. Just an interesting card. Next up, we've got Empyrean Eagle returns. This is a 2/3 bird spirit with flying for 3 mana in the colors of Azorius, and other creatures you control with flying get +1/+1. So, it's sort of a bird lord, but not really a lord for birds, a lord for all flyers. So, I don't know. I think maybe there's room in Standard for a go wide flying style deck. I don't quite know if this makes the cut. I think you need to go especially wide with flyers in order for it to be worth playing a card like this. Think along the lines of like the Boros Convoke deck. If there was like a flying version of that, which doesn't exist, but something like that would be a perfect home for this. I don't think at the end of the day it quite makes the cut in Standard. There could be some kind of new crazy flying tribal deck, but I doubt it. Where I really think this shines though is in Limited. Obviously there is going to be some kind of Flying Matters archetype within this set, and being able to grab this as a high pick and sort of build out your deck with that in mind seems pretty good. especially because evasion like flying is super good in limited, especially in draft. So yeah, I really think this has a place in limited. Not so sure about constructed though. Next up, we've got Painful Quandary. That's right, they're reprinting Painful Quandary, making sure it stays in standard. This is an enchantment for 2 black and 3. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. So this is a pretty crazy way to end games quick if you can manage to get it out. The big problem with something like Painful Quandary is that it's a do-nothing the turn that you play it. You just have to kind of put it out there and not impact the board at all. And I don't feel like there's really any space in standard for cards like that right now. But who knows? It could see use in some kind of a new combo deck. The potential is there, at least. I like the idea that this is going to be in standard for the foreseeable future, so that maybe at some point the right combination of card pool comes together where this could actually exist as a thing. We'll have to wait and see, but cool to see this return. Next up, we've got Battlesong Berserker. 1 red and 3 for a 3/4 human berserker. My dog is snoring. Hey Bandit, I'm trying to record. Could you not snore into my microphone? Thank you. Thank you. I love you. Whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. What I like about this card in particular is the fact that you don't have to have the Battlesong Berserker itself attack in order to get the attack trigger. Just comes down as a 3/4, can be a pretty decent blocker, not great for 4 mana, but decent blocker. And then, you know, something else that attacks gets +1/+0 and menace when it attacks. That could be really good, especially in limited. There's a lot of room for a card like this to do a lot of work in limited. So it'll be exciting to see if, you know, this ends up being better than I think most people will think on the surface. We'll see. But next up, we've got Consuming Aberration. This is the next rare. This is a horror for 5 mana in the colors of Dimir, and it has star power and star toughness. Consuming Aberration's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. And whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card, and then puts those cards into their graveyard. This is a weird one, because a part of me thinks this is going to be best in a mill deck, where all of the cards that you're casting are now helping you mill even more cards from your opponent. But that being said, 5 mana is kind of a lot. At that point, it comes down and you've probably already cast most of your spells. And in decks like that, I don't really think you care very much how much power and toughness a card like this has. So I'm not sure if this actually wants to be a part of a mill deck as a way to contribute to the win condition of milling your opponent, or if you really just want to focus on the power and toughness and have a really big 5 mana creature in just the right decks that kind of just force your opponent to fill up their graveyard quick regardless. Or maybe it's a sideboard card against self-mill strategies. I'm really not sure where this wants to live, but it's a very cool card, to say the least. A big creature that gets even bigger and helps you fill up your opponent's graveyard just seems kind of fun. If you have ideas about how you'd use this, definitely let me know in the comments, because potential for sure. But next up, we've got Fiery Annihilation. 1 red and 2 for an instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature, and then you exile up to 1 target equipment attached to that creature, and if that creature would die this turn, you also exile the creature instead. This is actually kind of insane for an instant. I don't think we've seen instant speed removal in red at 3 mana that's this good in quite a while. We did have sorcery speed removal that was 2 mana that would do 5 damage to something, and we've seen some instant speed removal that has like cost reduction where it can get down. There's that one card where you reduce the cost by however many attackers there are, so you get it down to like 1 red mana and do 5 to something. But just having a straight up 3 mana instant speed removal for anything that has 5 or less toughness, with these little bits of silver lining upside of exiling the creature and potentially exiling an equipment that's attached to that creature, I kind of love it, at least in limited. I'm still not entirely sure this makes the cut in constructed. I feel like most decks that are running red don't have room for 3 mana removal. But again, it's really nice having this sort of set the bar and be a baseline of like, this is what removal should look like at the very least, at the floor of the removal in red moving forward. This will be really good in limited though. This will be a very, very high pick, just being able to kill something huge at instant speed, exile it, potentially get other value. Just a good card in limited. But next up, we've got Mraa The Gravetide. This is a 6 mana 6/6 legendary elemental avatar in the colors of Sultai. During each of your turns, you may play a land and cast a permanent spell of each permanent type from your graveyard. I remember this guy was a part of one of my very first Magic Arena decks way back in the day when it was still standard legal, and I had so much fun with it. Just force your opponent to run out of removal, killing all your stuff, slam Mraa, and then just start to recast all of those things now that they're out of removal and can't take out the Mraa. Some interesting stuff you can do there, but the fact that you can play one permanent of each type is what makes it insane. And you can pull out your lands, so you can bring back a creature, you can bring back an enchantment, you can bring back an artifact, you can now bring back battles, which you couldn't do before because they didn't exist last time this card was in standard. Just a lot of potential, just a super fun card. It's definitely going to be a really fun possible like brawler commander type thing. I mean, technically it's already a brawler commander type thing, but seeing this in standard, I don't know, it really makes me want to brew with it for sure. I don't know where that deck would go yet. I'm really going to have to take some time and brainstorm it, but super, super fun card. Love seeing it come back to standard. Next up, we've got Burst Lightning. 1 red mana for an instant. It has Kicker 4, and it deals 2 damage to any target, but if it was kicked, it deals 4 damage instead. So nowhere near as good as the damage per mana of the last red removal spell we saw, but what makes this good is it has the upside of just being shock, right? It's just shock with upside. It's just a better shock, right? So most of the time you are going to play this for 1 red mana at instant speed, kill something that costs 2 or less or whatever. You can also hit them for 2 to the face. But later in the game, if you absolutely need to, you can kill a bigger creature or just finish them off. If you're out of gas and this is your last card, and now you have the mana, but you just don't have any spells to cast, you top deck this and you can do 4 damage to their head instead of 2, and it doesn't feel as bad. So if you look at it like it's a shock with just sheer upside, this is actually a pretty good card. I'm excited for this to come back into standard. I wonder if it'll see play there. It'll definitely see a lot of play in limited. But next up, we've got High Fae Trickster. This is 1 blue and 3 for a 4/2 fairy wizard with flash and flying. You may cast spells as though they had flash. Really good. I'm a little bit worried that 4 mana is a lot. Having to wait until turn 5 to start casting your spells at instant speed because of this being on the battlefield. I don't know if that might be too little too late. On the other side of the coin, getting a 4/2 flyer at instant speed that you can flash in, that now turns all of your sorceries and creatures and everything into, you know, flash, instant speed spells. Everything really. You could play battles at instant speed. You could play whatever you want at instant speed once this is out. I'm just having a hard time envisioning a deck that doesn't need to cast its things at instant speed before playing this, but then gets enough value off being able to cast them at instant speed after playing this for it to really be worth it. But maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe we don't need to go that deep with it. Maybe it's just really good in a flash deck, and, you know, giving everything flash is just the gravy on top and makes it even better. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe even Fairy Tribal could be a thing. Maybe this could go in Fairy Tribal and you could just start flashing out all of your fairies. there's definitely potential for this card. That line of text, being able to play everything at instant speed, is nothing you should underestimate or scoff at. It is a very powerful ability. I just worry if it might be too late in the game with it being a 4-drop. But let me know how you feel about it in the comments below. Let me know how you'd brew around it. I just think that this is such a cool card, and I'm really hoping it ends up being something relevant in Standard. But next up we have Heartfire Emulator. This is 1 red and 1 for a 2/2 human wizard with prowess. You can pay 1 red and sack this creature, and it deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker. This card is great. It's just a 2/2 prowess for 2. It's on rate. It might even make the cut in prowess decks right now, especially with Leyline being banned in best of 1. But then just getting the ability to sack it and do damage equal to its power to anything is kind of gnarly. Honestly, the more I think about it, the more I think this card has a chance at showing up in the prowess decks in Standard. Now, granted, you can't sack it and do its damage to someone's head, which is a huge downside, because that's kind of what the mono-red prowess style decks want to do right now. They're using those creatures that they can, you know, sack and do damage to the opponent's head. But still, having a prowess creature that has a built-in way to use it as removal, and that removal can scale to a certain extent, is pretty nice. So I'm going to say the potential's there. I'm leaning towards maybe not, because the ability can't hit the face, but I definitely think the potential is there for this to be good and constructed, and in the right archetype and limited, it's going to be great. But next up, we have Layline Axe. That's right, it's a Leyline, but it's an axe. This is 4 mana for an artifact equipment. If this card is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. So another free permanent if it's in your opening hand, which seems crazy to me. Equips for 3 mana. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, double strike, and trample. So it's sort of an Embercleave that's a Leyline. Seems kind of crazy. Granted, equipping it is still somewhat expensive, but this could be the straw that broke the camel's back as far as equipment decks. Maybe now we can actually play with all of the crazy equipment synergies that have been building up set to set to set that just aren't quite good enough for Standard. It seems like every set they introduce more ways of trying to push equipment decks and equipment synergies, and it's just never enough. Every set, it's just never quite enough. But they've been building up for a while. Is this the card that finally turns that into an actual Standard deck? Being able to just start with this on the battlefield, maybe slam some cards that reduce the cost of equipping things, so that equip cost goes way down. You can get a very early double strike trampling behemoth creature on the board potentially. I don't know. That might be a thing. At the very least, it's worth messing around with and experimenting with, because starting with this on the battlefield for free is nothing to scoff at. In fact, I have a deck I'm working on right now that just uses all of the Leylines with Rottenmouth Viper. So you just like play a turn 1 Rottenmouth Viper, and it's kind of a meme, but maybe this goes in there and helps make that deck just a little bit more consistent. I don't know. That deck will pop up on the channel at some point, so look forward to that. But will this make the cut in it? I mean, probably, right? It's better than some of the other Leylines. But overall, interesting card. I definitely want to mess around with. It could end up being absolutely insane in the right decks, so we'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Grappling Kraken. 5/6 Kraken for 2 blue and 4. What's Kraken? It has a landfall ability. Whenever a land you control enters, you tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. This is pretty decent. This is not going to make the cut in Constructed and Standard or anything like that, but still, seeing a card like this for Limited, for Draft, and things like that, it could be really powerful, especially if there is an archetype that allows you to ramp quickly, which not only lets you get the Kraken out earlier, makes it feel like it's cheaper, but also gives you the ability to landfall multiple times in a turn if you're playing a ramp deck, and get extra value out of it, put more stun counters on things. It could end up being really good and limited. It just needs exactly the right support. If there isn't enough ramp, specifically land ramp support for a card like this, at the, you know, common and uncommon rarities for limited, then it probably won't be consistent quite enough. And even if it is, you're probably only playing one at the top end, right? But still, pretty interesting card. Next up, we've got Electro Duplicate. 1 red and 2 for a sorcery. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it has haste, and at the beginning of the end step, you have to sacrifice the token. Also, it has flashback for 2 red and 2. Interesting card. This is very similar to Molten Duplication, which costs 1 less mana, but doesn't have the flashback. But the flashback makes it really interesting, especially when you consider the fact that you could play this in some kind of like a self-mill deck or a discard deck, like where you're looting a lot, and just get this into the graveyard and have it be free value later on in the game because it's just sitting there in the graveyard. I wonder if we're going to have enough cards that give you value from the graveyard for a deck built around that exact concept to maybe be a thing, to maybe like exist in standard. I don't know. It seems like it's probably a meme and janky, but I think we are getting to that point where we have enough cards that give you value from the graveyard that we can at least try, and that sounds kind of interesting. This also seems really good in like a sacrifice deck because you can just get copies of, you know, the best things that you have and then get extra value by sacrificing them to all of your sacrifice outlets that want things to sacrifice anyway. So there's definitely some ways to use this. If you have ideas, let me know in the comments because the potential for this card is real. But next up we have Rogue's Passage. This is a land, taps for a colorless mana. You can also pay for and tap it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn. I don't know how good this is in Constructed. It's probably not meant to really be a thing in Standard, but seeing it in Limited is actually kind of scary, right? You just toss one of these into your Limited deck, it's probably not going to mess with your color fixing enough just being a one of, but if you happen to get it out, you just make your best creature unblockable every turn. Granted, it takes a lot of mana, so you're slowing down your ability to keep pace with your opponent's board state, right? Your opponent's playing out a lot more each turn than you if you're spending 4 mana every turn to make something unblockable. But as a way for like a more control-oriented deck to have a win condition later in the game when you have plenty of extra mana floating around, does seem pretty good. So I'm excited to give this a try in Limited. Again, in Constructed, it's probably too cute to see play, although if there is some kind of an artifact deck or a mostly colorless deck that is viable in Standard, this would be sort of a no-brainer. If the ability is literally just free, if there's no opportunity cost because you don't have very many colored mana symbols in your deck, could be pretty cool there, but I think mostly this is just going to be really fun to experiment with in Limited. Next up, we've got Adventuring here. 1 mana for an artifact equipment. It equips for 1 mana, and it has a landfall ability, so whenever a land you control enters, equipped creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Kind of good. In the right deck, again, going back to what I said the last time we saw a landfall card pop up as a spoiler, it really needs a lot of support to make it good enough. If you're just putting this in a normal deck and trying to use it fairly, when you would just play a land here or there and buff up your dude, it's not going to be worth a deck slot, not in Limited. But if there is enough ramp, enough landfall support within the set at the common and uncommon rarities to really have that be kind of like a thing and a deck, you could play this and get a ton of value out of it, put it on your creature, get a bunch of triggers a bunch of turns in a row, and really be swinging in with a monstrous threat super early in the game. So it really depends on the support it gets. Could end up being amazing in Limited, could end up being kind of meh. In Constructed, landfall would have to really be a thing again to make a splash in Constructed. I don't think we're quite there, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point down the line we get another Standard set that brings back landfall. And at that point, some of the landfall stuff in Foundations might actually finally be good enough in conjunction with all of those new landfall cards to actually be a thing. So my gut tells me, as far as Standard is concerned with this card, that it's not going to be relevant right away, but it could be relevant later on. But next up, we've got Sphinx of Forgotten Lore. This is a mythic. A 3/3 Sphinx with flash and flying for 2 blue and 2. And whenever this creature attacks, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. Wow. So this is sort of amazing. If it didn't have the flash, I would be way more skeptical of a card like this, because it has to survive a turn cycle before it can swing in and get value. But the fact that you can just play this in a flash deck, play this in a counterspell deck, just wait until you don't have to use interaction, and just flash this in at the end of their turn, and then immediately untap and swing with it after they're already tapped out and you know your guy's protected, seems kind of amazing. Not only do you have a 3/3 threat that's swinging in the air every turn and is going to slowly help you close out the game, but you're going to get to recast your instants and sorceries basically every single turn. That seems awesome. I think this guy's going to end up being really good. One of the newest decks I posted as a deck tech on the channel was me doing Azorius with a splash of Jeskai Flash, and that deck is actually kind of insane. So this could pop up in there, or some new kind of flash or control brew. The potential is kind of off the charts for a card like this, so I'm really, really excited to see just how crazy this thing is in action. Just seems super good. But next up, we've got Cat Collector. 1 white and 2 for a 3/2 human citizen. When this creature enters, you create a food token, and whenever you gain life for the first time during each of your turns, you create a 1/1 white cat creature token. Actually seems pretty good. I like seeing cat tribal in limited. I also like that they're sort of hinting at, you know, life gain being a sort of archetype within limited, within draft and sealed, and not just being something you can build into in constructed, in standard. And that's really exciting for me. I think all of this life gain support coming out of this set means that it's absolutely going to be a contender in standard. Does this card itself actually make the cut in those types of decks? Probably not. Probably not. You can only trigger it once a turn the first time you gain life, and it just gives you a 1/1. It's still pretty good, but I think it's just shy of what the life gain decks are going to want in standard. But in limited, I think it's going to be amazing. And it is good enough that it could surprise me. It could surprise me and actually claim a slot in constructed. I don't think it will in standard, but the potential is there. It could surprise me. It's right on the cusp, you know? Being able to spit out an extra creature every single turn for free. Getting a little extra value when you immediately play it by getting the food token. It's not nothing. It's definitely going to be great in limited, but I don't think it's going to quite make the cut in standard. I really don't, but it's close enough that it could surprise me. Next up, we've got Tragic Banshee. This is a 5/3 spirit for 1 black and 4, and it has the Morbid ability. So when this creature enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. But if a creature died this turn, that creature gets -13 instead. I kind of love this ability. It sucks that it doesn't have flash. I mean, wanting it to have flash is probably way wishful thinking, but it would be nice if you could respond to things dying. Actually, you wouldn't want to respond to things dying, right? You'd want to wait until after it was dead anyway, so probably not a big deal. I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. Wishing this had flash that's way too much for an uncommon. Why would I even bring that up? But -13 on top of a 5/3 body for 5 mana is nuts. It's nuts. You just need a consistent way for things to die. Maybe this is like almost used like a Chupacabra, but in sacrifice style decks where you're sacrificing your own creatures for value and then you're able to turn on this Morbid ability. I think that's probably the best place to use a card like this. You could use it in a very controlling deck that you're killing your opponent's creatures and then doubling that up by killing another creature, dropping this. But that does get pretty mana intensive, I think. Whereas at least in sacrifice decks, you might have some sacrifice outlets that don't really cost any extra mana, or at the most maybe cost 1. and you can more easily get the value off of this guy. Either way, gonna be super fun and limited. Any kind of relevant creature threat, somewhat on rate, you know, creature threat that comes attached to creature removal is always super fun, and I tend to gravitate towards those cards, so it'll be fun just trying to figure out exactly how best to use this. But next up, we've got Doubling Season. 1 green and 4 for an enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. And if an effect would put 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it puts twice that many of those counters on that permanent instead. Doubling Season's nuts. It's always been nuts, and it's exciting that it's coming back to Standard. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm worried that Doubling Season decks might get out of hand. But at the very least, it's going to be a fun thing, right? I can't even think of what I would use this in Standard. Like, the possibilities are endless. We could do +1/+1 counter decks with, like, Innkeeper's Talent. We could do token decks with, like, Caretaker's Talent and add Doubling Season for Spice. There's probably way, way better, more competitive things you can do with this than what I'm bringing up. So if you have ideas, definitely let me know in the comments. But the potential for a card like this in Standard is kind of insane. So we'll see. We'll see. But next up, we've got Klingkant Skymage. What a weird name. This is a 1/1 bird wizard with flying for 1 blue and 3, which is very expensive. But whenever you draw a card, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. This is definitely way too slow, too expensive for Constructed. It's not going to really be a thing in Standard. But in Limited, this is actually pretty good, right? Being able to jam this out on turn 4 or maybe turn 3 with some ramp, and it just gets bigger every single turn. You don't have to do anything. It's just always swinging in as a relevant threat, helping to just lower the clock against your opponent in the air, and just getting bigger every single turn. And then if you're also playing with card draw spells, it's getting even bigger, even quicker. But it's nice that this is going to grow even without card draw spells, just off you drawing your card for the turn. And I think that's really what makes this usable in Limited. And I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being actually really good in Limited, especially if there's any sort of Limited archetype that's more control-oriented. If you can just control the board and jam this and just stall out the game a few turns, this just starts to take over. So, I don't know. It'll be really fun to see if something like that is going to be viable. But next up, we have Seeker's Folly. 1 black and 2 for a sorcery. Choose one. Target opponent discards 2 cards, or creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. I like seeing this in Foundations to sort of set the bar for modal spells and sort of say, like, this is the baseline, like, this is the floor, this is what you can expect for modal spells for newer players, and kind of set those expectations and introduce those players to these concepts. This card isn't amazing. It's not going to see much play in Constructed or anything like that, but it is a solid choice, like I said, for this set to set those expectations, and it is an interesting choice in Limited. Being able to have your -1/-1 removal spell double as discard, you know, if you're in a position where they're down to 2 or 3 cards in their hand, and you know it's their best cards that they've been trying to get to enough mana to play and just don't have enough mana to play yet, making them discard the 2 cards instead, and having that just be an option on the back of a removal spell that's never going to be useless, at least not entirely useless, is pretty cool. I don't expect it to be amazing, but it'll be somewhat useful and Limited. Next up, we've got Kellen, Planar Trailblazer. This card actually looks kind of insane. This is a 2/1 legendary human fairy scout for just 1 red mana. A new Kellen in Foundations. So it's just a 2/1 for 1, except it's got this extra value that it can accumulate over time. So for 1 red mana and 1 colorless, so a total of 2, if Kellen is a scout, it becomes a human fairy detective and gains whenever Kellen deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. This seems like an amazing card to play next to something like 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑛 any of those exile decks that get value off of playing things from exile, this is just a cheap, efficient creature you can get out early, start swinging in, and then start getting some of that value a little bit later on. Use this as a mana sink to just create more value over the course of the game. That sounds fun, but then it has another ability. 1 red and 2, if Kellen is already a detective, it becomes a 3/2 human fairy rogue and gains double strike. So then later in the game, if you're really completely out of things to do, you can dump your 3 mana into this and turn it into a 3/2 double striker that becomes sort of a win condition for you as well. So it's just a really aggressive turn 1 creature that can also get you card advantage after you level it up the first time, and can then become a ridiculous win condition if you level it up again. Kinda does everything. This card will absolutely be seeing play in Standard. Will it be a part of the new, like, mono red aggro deck? I don't know. I don't know if it's quite good enough, but there's definitely some deck out there that wants this. Like I said, the 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟 thing I think would be really amazing to pair with this, so I would not be surprised at all. That being said, I am exhausted and parched, so I need some coffee. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Wonders of the First. Wonders of the First is a brand new collectible card game similar to games like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, featuring a unique action-based resource economy that helps avoid pitfalls like Mana Flood or Mana Screw, and a battlefield containing multiple realms that unlock over time as you fight for control of the stones. The first 400 card set is called Existence and will launch to retail in the fall, but playtest team starter kits are available to order now. And they haven't forgotten about all you collectors out there. The game contains alternate borderless art variants, as well as highly sought after limited edition numbered prints, culminating in a 1-of-1 stone foil. And the best part is that the developers have a community first approach, with 8 print and play decks available on their website, as well as a version of the game available on Tabletop Simulator, all for free. For more information, be sure to check out wondersccg.com today. That's wondersccg.com. Glorious nectar of the gods. Man, it takes so long to get through all of these spoilers. Have to take a coffee break. Have to. But let's move on. We're starting with Elvish Reger, a 4/3 elf druid for 2 green and 2. When this creature enters, you return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. It's cool to see this kind of ability come back, but on a much more relevant body. A 4/3 for 4 is nothing to scoff at, especially in Limited. I actually expect this guy to be really strong in Limited environments, getting a very on-rate body for your 4 mana in Limited, while also getting your best permanent card back to your hand to reuse, is actually really good, I think, for a Limited format. In Constructed, I feel like the utility of getting a permanent back is better, and you don't necessarily need the body as much, so I don't quite think this makes the cut in Standard, but in Limited this is going to be gnarly, so I can't wait to play with it. Next up, we've got Bulk Up. This is 1 red and 1 for an instant. Double target creature's power until end of turn, so it's sort of like a poor man's double strike, and it flashes back for 2 red and 4. What's cool about this card is you can use it in conjunction with double strike, whereas if you were to give a creature double strike twice, the second time wouldn't do anything. But if you give a creature double strike and Bulk Up, you're essentially quadrupling the damage output, which is kind of insane. So I like seeing this as an ability, sort of as an instant speed combat trick, sort of being a thing, and having that interaction potentially with double strike. And then the fact that it has flashback is just even more gravy. So this kind of does everything. It could be a cool combo win condition under the right circumstances, like I said, with double strike, or it can be a combat trick to make sure you kill their thing in combat that you otherwise wouldn't. And the fact that you flash it back means you can kind of use it as both. You can use it early in the game as a combat trick to make the combat work out way less favorably for your opponent than they anticipate, but then you can also flash it back later in the game to just use it to kind of alpha strike and win. And I like that about it. And again, we get another card here that we don't mind self-milling and getting value off of later in the game, which is kind of cool. I don't know if this is going to be used that way in particular, but still cool that the potential for that exists. Next up, we've got Fishing Pole, a 1-mana artifact equipment. Equipped creature has pay 1, tap it, tap the fishing pole, and put a bait counter on the fishing pole. Also, whenever equipped creature becomes untapped, you remove a bait counter from the equipment, and if you do, create a 1/1 blue fish creature token, and then it equips for 2 mana. Flavor-wise, this is super on point. This is amazing when it comes to flavor. Now, I don't know how competitive it actually is. I think in Limited, it's actually going to be pretty good, because you get to just make token creature every single turn. Just keep making token creatures every single turn. And you don't really need to worry about it being slightly mana intensive and that sort of thing as much in Limited. But I wonder if this makes the cut in some kind of a constructed brew. It's going to only cost you a total of 1 mana and tapping to make a fish, right? And you can equip it to creatures that you don't want to attack with. You can equip it to something where you're going to hold it up as a blocker, and then after blocks before the end of their turn, you can tap them, put a bait counter on the fishing pole, untap them on your turn, and get the 1/1. That seems like a really good way to use it, and obviously it becomes better if you have, you know, more ways of putting this on multiple creatures. Maybe you could theoretically make a fish and then re-equip it to something else. How would that work? How would that work? Equipped creature becomes untapped. Remove a bait counter. So you only get a fish when something is untapped. When a creature specifically is untapped. That's interesting. Like, theoretically, you could put a bunch of bait counters on the fishing pole. Maybe use, like, use a way to increase counters. Why am I drawing a blank on the name of that ability? Oh my god. I need more coffee, I guess? Proliferate. Good lord. Proliferate. You proliferate more bait counters, and then theoretically you could find ways to untap your creatures. Equip this to a creature, untap it, make a fish. Equip it to a creature, untap it, make a fish. Theoretically, that's way too many hoops to jump through. That's not going to really be a thing. I'm just trying to think of outside of the box ideas for ways to use this card, and I'm probably thinking too hard. I think at the end of the day, this is just meant to make a token creature once a turn, every turn, with your blocker that you held up to block after they block on your opponent's turn. You know, tap it, do the bait counter thing. I think that's the best way to use it in the way it's intended. It's mostly going to be a limited trick, but still, my mind is racing with possibilities for how to break this card, and I don't think there are answers to that, but I don't know. It's fun. I like it. We're going to move on. Kykar, Zephyr Awakener. This is a 3/4 legendary bird wizard with flying for 1 blue, 1 white, and 2. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to choose one. Exile another target creature you control, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, or create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. The fact that this triggers off every non-creature spell you cast is insane. That means every single non-creature spell that you cast is a free extra flicker effect or a free extra 1/1 flyer. And what's great about this is normally you'd expect an ability like this to come attached to some kind of a clause where it's like, oh, only triggers once a turn or something like that. That's kind of been the norm lately, and it usually makes my eyes roll when I see that line of text. But you don't see that here. So just like literally every non-creature spell in your hand is also a flicker or a 1/1 flying token maker. And that seems gnarly. Do we run this with Caretaker's Talent and use it to make tokens to draw more cards off of Caretaker's Talent? Do we use it in a bird tribal deck? We already have the Swan from Bloomburrow that triggers and lets you exile things when other, you know, is it flyers or birds come into play? It's one or the other. It does seem like there's a lot of potential here for different ways to utilize this card. And I personally really love flicker effects and flicker style decks, blink decks. So I'm excited to see how deep this goes, and if we can actually build a deck like that that's viable in Standard. Seems super fun. If you have ideas about ways this card can be used, or cards that this can synergize with that I haven't mentioned, definitely let me know in the comments, because this is one that I want to brew with very, very much, and I'm excited to see what the possibilities for that are. But next up we have Seismic Rupture. This is 1 red and 2 for a sorcery, and it deals 2 damage to each creature without flying. So I will say this, if there is a Flying Matters deck in Standard, we talked about it a number of cards ago, this will actually make the cut. I don't know if that will be good enough to be a thing in Standard. I think it's mostly meant to be a thing as an archetype in Limited, and this will for sure be good in that Limited deck as a sweeper that just, under the right circumstances, if you build your deck right, acts as a one-sided sweeper. That's going to be really good in Limited. Potential is there in Standard, you know, in Constructed. I don't think so, but it's possible. Just a cool card overall. But next up we have Skyship Buccaneer, a 4/3 human pirate with flying for 2 blue and 3. And it has a raid ability, so when this creature enters, if you attacked this turn, you get to draw a card. This is actually really good. A 4/3 flyer for 5 that draws you a card, you know, in the common or uncommon slot for Limited specifically, is super, super good. Granted, you do need to jump through a hoop in order to draw that card, but it shouldn't be too tough. If you're playing this in the Flying Matters deck, you've probably got a little flyer you don't mind sending over that isn't going to get blocked because it has flying, just to make sure you turn on this ability to draw a card, and then this comes down and is a pretty decent body to block with, and an even better body to start swinging in and closing out the game as a win condition. It really comes down to being able to make sure you can consistently turn on that raid ability and draw that card. And like I said, you can do that in a Flyers deck. You could also potentially do this as the top end of a very aggressive deck, although I don't know how likely you are to add a 5 mana creature in a very, very aggressive aggro deck. So that doesn't line up quite as well. But the potential here for being a relevant win condition that also draws you a card, potential's through the roof, so we'll see. Next up, we've got Scavenging Ooze coming back to Standard. This is a 2/2 creature ooze for 1 green and 1. You can pay 1 green mana, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature and gain 1 life. So this card has always been good in Standard whenever it shows up in Standard, and I don't think it's going to be any different here. Being able to just exile whatever problematic cards from your opponent's graveyard for just 1 mana at a time in response to them trying to potentially use those cards or synergize with those cards is already kind of good, but getting a +1/+1 counter and a point of life every single time you activate it is just insane. This becomes a big threat pretty quickly. It helps gain life to buff your life total up so that you're sort of surviving against aggro, maybe even winning the race. And it gives you a way to exile things to trigger those types of synergies. So maybe we see this popping off in like Insidious Roots. I would not be surprised to see this as a main deckable card in a deck like that. So just lots of potential for Scavenging Ooze coming back to Standard. Super excited to see it. Wondering how much of an impact it will make this time. Next up we have Balmor, Battle Mage Captain. Kinda love seeing this come back into Standard. This is one of those abilities that I feel like deserves a little more love, and I think if we have a perfect storm of the Standard card pool looking just right, this might be good enough to play without cards that are so much better than it taking the slots over it. But this is a 1/3 legendary bird wizard with flying for 2 mana in the colors of Izzet, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, creatures you control get +1/+0 and trample until end of turn. So this is a really good option for those prowess style decks. It's just we have so many good cards right now that fit into those kinds of decks that it's really hard to make room, and this is fighting for slots with a lot of those cards. So it hasn't really been a huge contender you know, in the past in Standard, but hopefully at some point we'll hit that perfect sweet spot where this can be really at a point where it can make a name for itself. About to make a name for myself. Alright, Nessian Hornbeetle is next. This is a 2/2 bandit. Go back to bed. This is a 2/2 insect for 1 green and 1. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control another creature with power 4 or greater, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Very simple. 2/2 for 2, and it's going to get bigger every single turn as long as you have a 4 power creature. That's really good in the right deck, right? In Limited, this will be a very solid pick. You do want to make sure you're in the power 4 or greater style build. There's some cool ways to get to that. We have a lot of really good auras now. And it does seem like +1/+1 counters, sort of as an archetype, are kind of having a resurgence lately. At least the potential for that is having a resurgence. So it'd be fun to see if maybe we can get this into a deck where we're consistently getting to that power 4 without necessarily having to play expensive power 4 creatures. But there's potential with a card like this for sure, and it's going to be awesome in Limited. Next up, we've got Erudite Wizard. This is 1 blue and 2 for a 2/3 human wizard, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. This is meant to just be common filler in certain types of archetypes within Limited, where you're drawing, you know, double cards every turn. What's cool about a card like this too is keep in mind, if you have a way of drawing 2 cards on your opponent's turn, you can actually get this to trigger twice every turn cycle. So all you got to do is find a way to just draw an extra card on your turn to at least trigger it once. But then if you have like a divination style draw spell where you're drawing 2 at like instant speed, say, you can cast it. I know divination is sorcery, right? Not instant. But still, if you have an instant speed spell that can draw you 2 cards, you can also cast that on your opponent's turn and get another +1/+1 counter. I don't think this is anything super special to write home about, but if the ability to draw a ton of cards is consistent enough and really forms a backbone of an archetype, this could slot in as a nice 22nd, 23rd card in those types of decks to help, you know, fill out the mana curve. But next up, we have the return of one of my favorites, Giada, Font of Hope, a 2/2 legendary angel for 1 white and 1 with flying and vigilance. Each other angel you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it for each angel you already control. You can also tap her, add a white mana, and spend this mana only to cast an angel spell. I am really hoping that this is a sign that the question I've been asking myself in all of these spoiler videos is actually happening. Angel Tribal being relevant in Standard again. Please make it happen. So excited. I've brewed a lot of Angel decks in Standard when Giada was in Standard before rotation happened, and they were really cool. The one downside to those decks back then is we didn't really have a solid 2-drop to play alongside Giada. So a lot of times it was a situation where if we didn't have Giada on 2, the deck kind of stalled out a little bit and was super slow. So if we can get just one more good 2-drop angel to go alongside Giada, I do think angels can be back in a serious way. We've already seen a few angels that seem like they could make the cut in Standard. Excited to see how deep that well goes. Love having Giada. One of my favorite cards that rotated that I've been missing. So love to see this come back to Standard. Is Standard Angels gonna be a relevant deck again? I mean, you could argue it was never really a relevant deck. It was never tier 1, but I think some of the stuff that we brewed back when Giada was in Standard was close. And I think some of those decks were really awesome. So I'm hoping. Let me know what you think in the comments, but let's move on. Next up, we have Inspiration from Beyond. This is 1 blue and 2 for a sorcery. Mill 3 cards, return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, and then it also has flashback for 2 blue and 5. I wonder if a card like this might make the cut in the Azorius Oculus decks that we've been seeing lately, where they just want to fill up their graveyard with cards for Haughty Djinn, with cards for Oculus, and with those creatures themselves so that you can get them back with things like Helping Hand. Something like this might make the cut, especially because it does have that flashback cost. And granted, that flashback cost is super expensive, but it's extra, right? So I don't know, maybe it makes the cut. The other thing this really has me wondering is how deep an archetype like this goes in limited. For a card like this to make the cut as an uncommon in the set, it definitely has to be a part of a significant archetype in limited for the set. So now I'm super curious just how deep an archetype that wants this is going to go and how relevant it's going to be in limited. It's going to be fun to see how that shakes out. But next up, we've got Reassembling Skeleton, a 1/1 skeleton warrior for 1 black and 1. You can pay 1 black and 1 to return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, Reassembling Skeleton is overcosted compared to some of the other options we have in Standard that do similar things. But the one cool thing about Reassembling Skeleton is that it doesn't have any hoops to jump through in order to return it. All of the other cards that return themselves in some way have some kind of condition they need to meet in order to do it. Reassembling Skeleton doesn't. If it's dead, you just pay 2 and put it back on the battlefield. Whenever you want, you just keep doing it. Really good for sacrifice decks, even though it is a little bit overcosted for something you want to keep sacrificing. But there is the potential there. It also has the potential to show up in skeleton tribal decks, which I think are going to be really powerful moving forward, using cards like Corpse of the Lost, in case of the Stash Skeleton and stuff like that. So we've also got Tiny Bones, Bauble Burglar, that's coming into Standard in this set. So excited to see if Reassembling Skeleton's actually good enough to make the cut. Either way, it's going to be really fun to use this in limited. Next up, we have Slumbering Cerberus, 1 red and 1 for a 4/2 dog. It doesn't untap during your untap step, and it has the Morbid ability, so at the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, you untap this creature. That actually seems really good. It just swings in every turn, and as long as you have a sack outlet, if you're in a sack deck and you have a way to sack something negligible and get value, you can just keep untapping it, and in that way, it's like it's a 4/2 Vigilance for 2, which seems kind of insane to me, but you do need to consistently be able to trigger that Morbid ability in order for it to truly be worth it. But even in some situations, it might be worth playing just as a 2 mana 4/2 blocker, as something you can throw out there for 2 mana that makes their 4/4s not want to swing in at you, or else you get a huge tempo advantage by only losing your 2-drop. That seems like it could be cool too, so I do think there's a lot of potential for something like this in limited. I don't think it quite makes the cut in constructed, because I think sacrifice decks are going to have better things to do than swing with a 4/2. But still, pretty cool card. I like it. Next up, we've got Alesha, Who Laughs at Fate. This is a 3 mana 2/2 legendary creature human warrior in the colors of Rakdos. It has First Strike. Whenever it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and that happens no matter what. But it also has a raid ability, so at the beginning of your end step, if you attacked this turn, return target creature card with mana value less than or equal to Alesha's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, there is a key part of this card that is easily overlooked that makes it way, way, way better than it might seem on first inspection. That raid ability, it doesn't say that Alesha has to attack this turn. It just says if you attacked this turn. That means if you slam this on turn 3 and you attacked with your team, you still get to trigger it at the end of turn and get a creature back. That seems insane. Granted, you can only get like a 2/2, right? But or 2 mana creature rather, because Alesha will just be a 2/2. But still, if you're playing a really fast aggro deck that's using all 1 and 2 drops, being able to get the one thing they used their removal spell on, or the one thing that they blocked and traded with, back for free because you slam an Alesha is nuts. And what's even cooler about Alesha is you don't have to play it first, right? You can swing in, your opponent doesn't know that Alesha's coming, and trades, you know, their 2-drop for your 2-drop, and then you slam Alesha, and the raid ability still triggers at the beginning of your end step, and you get your 2-drop back. And then even if they kill the Alesha, you still made them trade and got your thing back, so their creature's gone, your creature's back, and you forced them to use a removal spell on Alesha. So worst case scenario, even if they kill her, you gained a ton of value and a ton of tempo advantage, and it's just insane. But if they don't kill her, she swings in as a 3/3 first striker, and then you get back a 3 mana card at the end of your turn. or a 4 mana the next turn. You can just scale it up. It just seems insane. Honestly, the more I think about this card, the more insane I think it is. I cannot wait to brew around it. Are we going to do a human tribal deck? Probably. Are we going to do some kind of a Rakdos aggro deck? Most certainly. This card is the real deal. And there will absolutely be some very competitive decks using her on day one. I promise you. But moving on, we've got Micromancer coming back into Standard. This is a 3/3 human wizard for 1 blue and 3. When this creature enters, you may search your library for an instant or sorcery card with mana value 1, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This card's awesome. It's even better now, and everyone sort of forgets that it exists, but one really cool thing you can do with this card now that makes it so much better than it used to be is you can search for all of the spree cards. The spree cards that came out during Thunder Junction that cost like 1 mana, but they have additional modes that you can pay extra mana and turn on. And so the more mana you have to sink into them, the more effects you can trigger and the more value you can get out of the card. A lot of those cards are just have a base mana cost of 1. They're 1-drops that have all of those extra costs, so you can search them out with Micromancer. There's an instant speed sweeper you can search up with Micromancer. There's just so much value you can get with this card now. Granted, it needs to be a control deck, right? You need to be dragging the game out. You need to give yourself time to get that value and make that value matter. If your opponent's bearing in on you with an aggro deck, like a 3/3 for 4 mana isn't going to do very much to slow them down. So it's not super useful in every situation, but if you can put yourself into the right situation to get the value off of this card, it can be pretty nuts. So I do like seeing it come back to Standard here. But next up, we've got Overrun, the king of alpha striking spells. This is sorcery for 3 green and 2. Creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. So go wide with all of the creatures ever, and then slam Overrun, buff your board, win the game. It's pretty simple. This was, you know, a tried and true staple of Magic for as long as I can remember. Used to run it in like Elf Ball style decks. Super fun. I don't know if it's good enough to make the cut in Standard anymore with today's power creep and power level, but we're gonna find out. Next up, we've got an offer you can't refuse. How about a coffee I can't refuse because I'm parched? Nectar of the Gods. Nectar of the Gods. 1 blue mana for an instant. Counter target non-creature spell. Its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. What a card. This coming back into Standard, how relevant is it going to be? It can counter any non-creature spell. Can't counter a creature, and you give them 2 treasure tokens. You know what this makes me want to do? This makes me want to go back to Mraa The Gravetide, which, for those of you who have been longtime viewers on the channel, you might remember a Mardu deck that I posted a while back called Mraa The Gravetide. Now, this wouldn't be used in the Mardu version. This would be used in either Jeskai or Grixis. But the concept would be the same because you use things like Generous Plunderer, which gives them a treasure every turn, and when it attacks, it deals damage to them equal to the number of artifacts they have. Well, now if they have 2 treasure tokens, you get to deal more damage quicker. And we could also use that with Combo Profiteering Mare, because you'd get the treasure tokens yourself as well, because when they get tokens, you get tokens off of Combo. So there's some interesting things you could do there, and I think that's the way I'd want to go with a card like this when it comes to brewing something up for the channel, and see if something like that could shake out utilizing blue. I think that would be really fun. But is this good enough to just see play in normal control decks or maybe in their sideboards? Hard to say. Giving your opponent 2 treasures, that's a lot of ramp, right? That could be like absolutely backbreaking under the right scenario. That being said, 1 mana to counter their insane best spell, 1 mana to counter their Sunfall or whatever, seems really good. So I don't know. Let me know how you feel about this card down below. I really have no idea if this is going to be usable in Standard. I really don't. But next up, we have High Society Hunter. And my allergies are kicking in. I apologize. This is a 2 black and 3, 5/3 Vampire Noble with flying. And whenever this creature attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And whenever another non-token creature dies, you draw a card. Glorious. Now that last line of text, that is the power of this card. Everything else is gravy. The fact that every time a non-token creature dies, you draw a card, it doesn't even care if it's yours or theirs. You can be killing their stuff with Go for the Throat or whatever, drawing cards. You could be sacrificing your stuff in a sacrifice deck, and you're drawing cards. And the fact that every single time you swing, you get a free sack outlet that also puts a counter on this is just gravy. It's just another way to kind of take advantage of a sacrifice style deck that you're slotting this into, which is really nice. And it's a 5/3 flying vampire for 5, so it's kind of like a win condition by itself as well. But you should definitely be focused on that last line of text, because that's what's going to make or break the card. Like, whether this card sees play, any real play in Standard, is wholly dependent on how consistent that ability pops off and how relevant it is at the time that you can actually get this onto the board. And 5 mana is kind of a lot. You really got to kind of jump through hoops to get to a point where you're playing this and being able to get the value off of it while that value is still useful. But I think there's a lot of potential for this card to really take off and really be a thing. I think that ability is super powerful, and I'm really surprised it's not limited to once a turn. We normally see that kind of thing limited to once a turn. So I'm excited. I'm excited to mess around and see what we can do with this. It is worth noting it has to be a non-token creature. So if it is some kind of a sacrifice brew that you are building around this card, you do want to be careful to have actual creature cards, not token creatures. And that could be a little tricky sometimes, because most sacrifice decks want to use token creatures, but it's not unheard of. It's not impossible. There's definitely a world where we can build the right kind of sacrifice deck, where we're playing a lot of cheap creatures that are actual creatures that we can sacrifice, and we're getting extra value off those creatures, but it's not necessarily in the form of token creatures or anything. So we'll have to wait and see, but man, the absolute insane value potential of this card is pretty nuts. Next up, we've got Needletooth Pack. This is a 4/5 dinosaur with Morbid for 2 green and 3. And the Morbid ability is, at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. The fact that it's a target creature you control and not this creature is what makes this so good. This is going to be great in green decks in Limited. Granted, 4/5's a little bit underrate for 5 mana, but green is the color of ramping. It should be pretty easy to consistently ramp at least 1 mana's worth, or 1 land's worth, by the time you play this. Get it out a little easier, get it out a little cheaper, or sooner rather. Man, just being able to hand out +1/+1 counters every time a creature dies, it's almost like you get to retain all the value of your creatures, especially if you're in a go wide deck. So yeah, I think this is going to be best in some kind of a crazy go wide creature deck where you have a lot of smaller creatures, and then, you know, 1 dies, you throw counters, 1 dies, you throw counters, and sometimes you're even getting more power and toughness from the counters than what you lost with the creature. Whereas if you're playing it in a deck with less creatures and those creatures are bigger and more impactful, you're not getting as many counters as what you lost in your power and toughness when the creature died. So I guess the other way to look at it is, it doesn't have to be a creature you control. You kill their creatures, you hand out +1/+1 counters. That seems really good, actually. You know what? The more I think about this card, the better I think it is. Just being able to, every time a creature dies, no matter what, you get a trigger at the end of your turn. But it is at the end of your turn, so you have to kill their creature on your turn, or your own creature on your turn. You don't want to do any of your creature killing or sacrificing on your opponent's turn, and that does make things a little interesting. But I think this card is cool. I think it'll be fun to experiment with this and just see how viable it ends up being. Next up, we've got Self-Reflection. This is 2 blue and 4 for a sorcery. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, and it flashes back for 1 blue and 3. So what's cool here is the flashback cost is cheaper than the hard cast cost, which is nice because you can play this in decks where you're like self-milling and stuff, and it's just getting into your graveyard in other ways, and then it's just free value that you can get later on, right? 4 mana without really costing you a card, and just make a copy of a creature you control. And it's not even like one of those until end of turn copies or anything like that. You just have a token that's a copy forever. And then maybe you can use that with something like 3 Blind Mice to make more copies of it. I don't know. My brain is getting out of hand. I need more coffee. I need more sleep. I need this video to be over because it's exhausting. But the cards are looking sweet, so this one, gonna be fun to mess around with. Next up, we have Arbiter of Woe. 2 black and 4 for a 5/4 demon. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you sacrifice a creature. It has flying, and when this creature enters, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. You draw a card and gain 2 life. So this does so much. The one real downside to this is the fact that you do have to sacrifice something when you play it. But if you're in a sacrifice style deck, and you want to sacrifice your things, that could be an upside. That being said, 6 mana, still kind of a lot, right? Still kind of a lot. I think the best way of playing this card is probably in some sort of reanimator build, where you can get it onto the battlefield with a reanimation spell, not have to pay the additional cost of sacrificing a creature, and then you still get the ETB triggers, right? They still discard, you still draw, you still drain for 2, all of that, and you have a 5/4 flying. It's not the best reanimator target in the world. I wonder if there's another way to kind of bend or break a card like this and get it onto the battlefield without necessarily hard casting it, but without reanimating it from the graveyard. Is there some kind of sneaky, cheeky, cute way of getting this onto the battlefield a different way? If you have ideas, let me know in the comments. I feel like there's potential with this card. But next up, we have Koma, World Eater, a brand new version of Koma. Love seeing this. This is an 8/12 Legendary Serpent for a whopping 7 mana in the colors of Simic. It can't be countered. It has Trample. It has Ward 4. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you create 4 3/3 blue serpent creature tokens named Koma's Coil. This is insane. This guy is so insane. Granted, he's super expensive, but he's a really good reanimation target. The only problem with that is you don't really get access to his "this spell can't be countered" clause. That part ends up being redundant if you're using a reanimator spell. But the Ward 4, super relevant. If you can get this out early with a reanimation spell, that Ward 4 is going to keep them from being able to kill it for at least a couple turns, unless they have, you know, a sweeper or something like that. So getting to at least swing in once with your 8/12 Trampler and make 4 3/3s before they can finally remove it. And even when they can remove it, they probably have to tap out, pay all of their mana to do it, and you're way ahead on tempo. Just seems insane. I'm excited about using this card, about finding ways to make it better. I don't know if this wants to go in Reanimator or if it wants to go in like some kind of a new ramp deck. A ramp deck could ramp you up to the mana you need to hard cast it and not only get this thing out quick, but also, since you're casting it, you'd get that "this spell can't be countered" clause. In fact, maybe we use some way that lets us free cast something, right? Like if we had a Koma off an Atali and free cast it, it would still have the "this spell can't be countered" clause, even though we're playing it for free. So it'd kind of be the best of both worlds, right? Maybe there's a world where something like that can happen. If you have ideas about ways that we can free cast Koma here, I'm all ears. Please let me know in the comments. This isn't quite as good as the last version of Koma we got in Kaldheim, but still love this card. It still looks super fun, and I'm excited to mess around with it. But that brings us to our last card of the day, Sire of 7 Deaths. A 7/7 Eldrazi for 7 colorless mana. With First Strike, Vigilance, Menace, Trample, Reach, Lifelink, and Ward pay 7 life. I love this card. I love how simple it is, but how powerful it is. They didn't put Annihilator on it. They didn't put any crazy long text abilities on it. It's just every keyword ever and Ward pay 7 life. That's a 7/7 for 7. Let's go. I love it. I love it. You can use this in Reanimator. You can use this in ramp decks. This has got to make an impact in Standard, right? Like, if you're just playing it fairly and waiting till you get to 7 mana and then playing it, it's not good enough for Standard. But there's so many different ways to free cast things these days. Do we use it with Cruel Claw and try to get it onto the battlefield that way? Do we use it with Reanimator? Do we use it with things that free cast stuff? I don't know. Let me know how you'd want to use this card in the comments below, because it's just awesome. And again, this being Foundations, this being sort of like a core set and a foundational set for newer players, I love that we're introducing them to Eldrazi's and introducing them to the concept of a really huge, ridiculous, awesome creature without making it overly complicated with a huge text box. It's just a whole bunch of keywords. And something about that really speaks to me. I just really love that something like this is in this set particularly. And it'll be fun to see how relevant it can actually be in Standard. I'm pretty excited about it. Let's do it. But that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for checking out the video. If you could do me a huge favor and hit that like button, helps the video get out to so many more people. I would appreciate it so much. Also, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons more content on the way. Tons of crazy deck ideas. More spoilers. All things that are good. Catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/QuarantineCapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Damn it, I'm tired and I need more coffee. So I'm going to end this video and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.